In the spirit of the Tholos Circle, where ancient thinkers gathered to debate the issues of today, this is Tholos Talks. Through deep insight and thought-provoking dialogue, we offer the tools to decode complexity and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome back to the Basilinna podcast. In this episode, we delve into the shadowy world of the illicit trade in antiquities. How does this hidden market operate, and who are the key players? From museums and art dealers to archaeologists and criminals, we'll explore the intricate web of actors driving this billion-dollar black market. To guide us through this fascinating yet troubling topic, we're joined by Tess Davis, the Executive Director of the Antiquities Coalition, a think and do tank committed to ensuring the trade in ancient art and artifacts is legal and ethical. And in all transparency, I'm the founder of the Antiquities Coalition. A lawyer and an archaeologist by training, Tess has spent her career on the front lines of the fight against cultural racketeering. Her work has taken her across the globe, from crime scenes to courtrooms, exposing how stolen cultural treasures fund organized crime, terrorism, and sometimes even war. Working alongside Cambodian colleagues, Tess uncovered a major criminal network that directly linked the Khmer Rouge's reign of terror with the art world elite. The royal government of Cambodia knighted Tess for this work, which sadly continues today, and we'll hear a lot more about that in this episode. With her unparalleled expertise and firsthand experience, Tess will help us unravel the complexities of this clandestine world, shedding light on why combating antiquities trafficking is critical, not only for preserving cultural heritage, but also for supporting human rights and improved global security. Let's dive into it. Tess, you've been described as a real-life Indiana Jones, traveling from looted temples to the halls of the UN in the fight against antiquities trafficking. How did you find yourself in this role?
Well, Deborah, first of all, thank you so much for having me on today. It's a pleasure to discuss this. I actually grew up in a small town in Georgia, so far removed from all of this, and now live in New Orleans. But a school-age project on the Kingdom of Cambodia interested me first in the country itself, and then in its archaeology, and led me to pursue this at school. It's been a fascinating 20 years ever since.
Well, you bring a unique perspective as well, because you're both an archaeologist and an attorney.
Yes, no, and I heard a joke from a comedian recently who has a wife who is an archaeologist and a lawyer himself. And he said, you know what? She's a professional at arguing and bringing up the past. It's a difficult thing. I, had originally been planning to go the full academic route. And certainly that is so important. Archaeologists are uncovering so much of our past and our history. But my time in Cambodia made me realize that if there's not more lawyers working in this area, there's not going to be anything left for the archaeologists to study.
Absolutely. And the legal fight has become so critical. And as you said, there are so few attorneys who have an understanding of these two worlds. Speaking of Indiana Jones, we've all seen the Hollywood movies or read the books about tomb raiders and art smugglers, and the search for buried treasure has been going on ever since there was treasure to be buried and is the stuff of legend. However, it's also a crime with real consequences and victims. So Tess, as the Executive Director of the Antiquities Coalition, this is your job. Please tell us about why this is a global problem and why people have not focused on it as a real global crime as such.
Well, in many ways, this is not a new problem. As long as there have been tombs, there have been tomb raiders. And certainly as long as there have been civilizations, there have been enemy armies waiting to plunder them. We all know that the reason the King Tut tomb is so important is that it's one of the few that were not heavily looted in antiquity by grave robbers. And there's also long been a realization that, this isn't just a problem. It can be a crime. Indeed, arguably the most famous lawyer in history, Cicero, actually prosecuted a case about art theft, 2,000 years ago. And the Elgin or Parthenon marbles, their acquisition was incredibly controversial even back then. Lord Byron, frequently called the world's first rock star, very, very passionately campaigned against them. But so on the one hand, this has long been a problem. People have long spoken out against it. But despite what We sometimes hear from a museum curator or director on the hot seat. There's long been this fight against it. In the modern world, because of a wide range of factors, first of which is that there is a sizable financial market for this material, we're seeing looting and trafficking take place at a scale that's really unprecedented in history. And the situation is getting worse, not better, as the market changes. For example, at the Antiquities Coalition, we're frequently, mistakenly contacted by traffickers around the world who see the name of our organization and think that we are antiquities dealers offering us pieces directly. Someone on the border, the Syrian border, can now through DHL, ship a piece to the heart, the American heartland, basically overnight. You can peddle these wares not just at brick and mortar galleries, but also on Facebook, through WhatsApp, on eBay. It's democratized the market in a bad way. It's helped build up the market in a bad way. And so the scale of looting and trafficking that we're seeing now, it's literally visible from space by satellite imagery. It is so bad.
Tess, you mentioned several very high-profile antiquities that had been looted in the past. As we think about the legal system, the importance of attorneys in this field, there's a very clear line pre-1970s and post-1970s. Can you share with us what that is?
Yes, so 1970 marks the date of what is still the major international treaty in this area, the 1970 UNESCO Convention. And this agreement was a watershed moment. While the treaty is quite aspirational, it declares that trade in art, antiquities, and other cultural objects that are contrary to its terms is illicit, and it should be treated as such by state parties. And in many ways, this was a novel idea at the time. Obviously, that agreement is half a century old at this point, but still makes up our legal framework. So it was created for a world that really doesn't exist anymore, a world of brick and mortar galleries, pre-internet, pre-WhatsApp, pre-social media. And we're still honestly waiting for the law to catch up to these changes. But 1970 is a hugely important date. It represents a bright line, ethically, if not always legally, that material coming out of a country of origin after that, again, should be considered illicit.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really important distinction to understand because it distinguishes between debates over, say, the Rosetta Stone and the return to Egypt versus something that might have been looted. For example, the full gold-sized mummy that had been looted from Egypt and was found at the Met Museum because it was looted in 2011. Let's talk about who are the key players who are involved in this black market, from the looters to the buyers.
Obviously, in Hollywood films and paperback novels, there are quite colorful characters. Indiana Jones himself arguably looted a number of pieces, Lara Croft, Thomas Crown. And certainly they're colorful characters in real life too. But in reality, the bad guys are some of history's worst bad guys. Today, in the last decades, over the last half century and beyond, dating back to World War II, some of history's worst villains have been responsible for looting and trafficking art and antiquities. Of course, the Nazis were notorious plunderers, and we are still in the process of recovering and returning, Holocaust-looted art today, but also actors like the Khmer Rouge, and to get into more recent years, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, certainly the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. All of these groups have been involved not just in looting and trafficking, but organized looting and trafficking to help fund crime, to help fund armed conflict, and even to help fund terrorism. These links are real and they're proven. And unfortunately, there's more and more evidence available of this every year. That said, these criminals don't exist in isolation. There are people and professionals who might not consider themselves criminals, but are nonetheless crucial to criminal schemes, either through direct participation or just by turning a blind eye. And this crime, art and antiquities crime, could not succeed without the complicity of dealers, curators, auctioneers, and collectors, also bankers, lawyers, accountants, shippers. These individuals have the power to be gatekeepers, stopping them in their tracks, but far too often they have become enablers.
Yeah, and we haven't seen that the penalties really fit the crime.
Exactly. These crimes have huge impact financially, again, in terms of issues of economic integrity. And I mean, it's no exaggeration to say national security when a group like ISIS is able to make millions of dollars off of this. But we haven't seen the criminal penalties reflect that harm yet.
Let's talk now about a specific case, because you were very instrumental in uncovering the trafficking network of Douglas Latchford, who you've called a one-man supply and demand for blood antiquities from Cambodia. And so for nearly half a century, this English adventurer successfully laundered countless masterpieces from Cambodia. And they have shown up in some of the world's leading museums, private collections, even in the auction houses, very prominently at Sotheby's. So tell us, what happened here? How was he able to operate for so long? And even today, people are still tracking down antiquities into well-respected institutions that came through his network.
Well, Latchford, I realize, is not a household name, although he is certainly notorious in circles dealing with archaeology and this issue. But for those of your listeners who have not heard about him before, he died in 2020. And, the New York Times carried a very prominent obituary for him saying, Douglas Latchford, Khmer antiquities expert, dies. And this title was an interesting choice because while he was a collector and a dealer, wasn't a trained art historian, wasn't a trained archaeologist or scholar. He was a business tycoon who had claimed to have made his millions in pharmaceuticals and real estate. But when he died under a felony indictment, fighting extradition back to the United States for masterminding this organized antiquities trafficking network, which had plundered countless, we're talking hundreds, perhaps thousands of museum quality masterpieces from Cambodian war zones into the world's very top collections, the top private collections, the top auction houses, the top galleries, the top museums around the world. And he linked with one hand actors like the Khmer Rouge, responsible for one of the worst genocides of the 20th century, again, with the other hand, these very elites of the art world. Much of this is now a matter of public and legal record because he led to quite a lot of federal investigations and even prosecutions. We're still uncovering the full extent of his crimes. Every year, there's more information that comes out about this, just what was done. And we might never know the full story.
Tess, even he was a feature of the Pandora Papers, which exposed his network.
Yes, much of what we know about Latchford has come out from, law enforcement investigations, but also diligent work by investigative journalists, first from the New York Times and then more recently, the Washington Post. And as you mentioned, the Pandora Papers, along with so many prominent figures around the world, really shed light on not only how he was able to successfully run this trafficking network for, we're talking half a century, but also how he was able to hide arguably hundreds of millions of dollars in criminal proceeds through this very complex network of offshore accounts, tax havens, and trust. And so, following the money, uncovering those details will hopefully help with future investigations and prosecutions and making the market safer, not just to protect our cultural heritage, but also to protect, the vast majority of legitimate collectors, dealers, and others who were defrauded, and were victims of Latchford as well.
Yeah, and talk about some of the specific cases that you're aware of. How is he getting these antiquities out? What was the link to the Khmer Rouge?
So while I was saying that, this field does not have the colorful characters of Lara Croft, etc., Latchford is one exception. He does in many ways seem like a work of fiction, even though, again, there's great evidence documenting all of this now. He was an Englishman born into what was then still the British Raj. He traveled to Southeast Asia in the 1950s seeking his fortune. And he settled in Bangkok and, like so many, found Cambodia to be this oasis of peace in war-torn Indochina. And he was drawn to its ancient past. He's even told the New York Times that he believes he was the reincarnation, not just of any Cambodian king, but of the most famous one whose face is overlooking, so much of the temples of Angkor, and that all of these statues had once belonged to him in these previous lives. When Latchford came on the scene, Cambodia's history was still remarkably intact. French explorers described its sites as being these open-air museums. And the pieces that had been removed were very well documented. Once Latchford does appear, these pieces start disappearing from temple to temple. And these statues that had been in place, not just for centuries, but millennia, start to vanish overnight. And of course, then Cambodia fell into one of the worst conflicts of the 20th century, one of the worst genocides of the 20th century, which is a pretty crowded list, unfortunately. And when the country finally reopened decades later, just about every known archaeological site had been not just plundered, but extensively plundered. And we now know that Latchford's network was responsible for a great deal of this. He worked with looters on the ground, including a large number who were with the Khmer Rouge, who would dig up these pieces, break them into parts, transfer them across the heavily violent, heavily landmined border between Thailand at this point to Latchford's waiting hands. And then he would not just traffic them overseas, but he would launder them. So just as you launder money to take illegal money and make it look clean, he would take these blood antiquities in every sense of the name, develop these past stories for them, and launder them onto the legitimate market. And so he's frequently referred to as a Janus figure, a term that was coined by Dr. Simon McKenzie in this case, because with one hand, he was literally dealing with the Khmer Rouge, and with the other hand, dealing with, say, the head of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York.
Let's just keep going through this network because I think it's very helpful to understand. We have confessions from some of the looters who could identify some of the actual statues. And then he had co-conspirators in the United States who were helping to validate these items.
Yes, exactly. And, it's hard to see how everyone did not see through what was happening at the time. Obviously, the conflict in Indochina and Cambodia specifically, this was the major international headline in the 1970s and much of the 1980s and 90s. And yet the Western art market needed very little encouragement to welcome Latchford's loot and pay very handsomely for it. If your listeners have seen a Cambodian sculpture in an American museum, odds are very high they have seen a piece that went through his hands. He was incredibly prolific. And again, we're learning more and more every year, and the picture is getting worse and worse.
Didn't he cooperate with academics and dealers?
Again, his network, would not have survived had it not been for the complicity of so many archaeologists, art historians, and those in the museum community. They helped to give him legitimacy. They helped develop backstories.
Through all these investigations, quite a large amount of detail has come out about his network that even some of the actual looters have confessed and remember in great detail their participation in some of the actual looting. But there were also people in the United States who were helping to support him in this illicit trade. Is that right?
That's completely right. And the information we now have is very damning about the complicity of archaeologists, of museum curators, and others in this world. They really they were crucial to Latchford's scheme, to be able to allow him to get these pieces with, again, no backstory whatsoever, often missing their feet and their pedestals into the top collections. One such figure was Emma Bunker, who was a hugely respected scholar in the field, worked closely with the museum in Denver. And we now know worked closely with Latchford and helping with this network. Likewise, Nancy Weiner, who was a very prominent second generation. Her mother had been Doris Weiner. This is arguably the most premier family, the very top dealers of Asian art. We now know, after she was indicted and tried, was an active part of this network as well.
Where were these ending up?
They were, everyone was buying them, which is interesting. And we learn about new pieces each year. Certainly a number went into major museums. And we're not talking about backwater institutions. We're talking, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the British Museum in London. The Met dealt with him a great deal. A curator there, again, highly respected at the time, Martin Lerner. We've now learned that he had a number of private business dealings with Latchford and then conveniently turned a blind eye when these pieces came into the collection. They weren't alone. Private collectors were buying these as well. Jim Clark, the founder of Netscape, to his credit, voluntarily returned tens of millions of dollars worth of Latchford loot once learning of its illicit origin because of the lack of transparency in the art market. We know of a number of pieces that are still missing, and we may never learn, where they are. They could be in a private collection anywhere around the world, and maybe they'll resurface when the owner of that collection passes away and they re-enter the market. But we might not ever learn where all of these pieces are.
And I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from this experience that we can draw in more modern times related to what happened with ISIS, what we saw with the destruction of Palmyra and some of these other places. One being that it's a lingering impact, that often these items don't come out immediately, but they're stored until attention is diverted onto other topics. And then we start to see them come out on the market, but also there needs to be time to create these false provenances. What would you say are some of the analogous lessons that we're seeing today from what you had learned during that time?
Well, you're completely right that once war breaks out, once these trafficking networks are created, these wartime trafficking networks, they often survive the conflict. They long outlast the wars that enable them. And we see this not just in the case of Cambodian antiquities, but Nazi looted art, decades and decades, approaching a century in our lifetimes, probably later. There's still hundreds of thousands of Holocaust looted pieces that have not been identified and returned. Again, with the Cambodian conflict, the vast majority of these pieces will probably never be identified and returned. And we're seeing new conflicts break out around the world every year. And these countries face a long road ahead. It's going to be decades and centuries before they're able to start recovering from this. It's a problem that lasts a very long time.
I mean, it was a fascinating case to look at what happened in Iraq and Syria with ISIS, because they had a very systematic and organized plan when it came to antiquities trafficking, didn't they? They had a ministry of extraction that was established. Part was for oil and part was for antiquities. And it was viewed as a resource that people would be licensed to go out and track.
Yes, and what we have learned, the ISIS case is incredibly interesting and incredibly troubling because of the vast scale of their operations and obviously of where this money was going. We learned much of the details of this from a U.S. Special Forces raid, which went into the compound of what they called their emir of oil and gas and natural resources. And as you mentioned, they considered art and antiquities a natural resource. And so this U.S. Special Forces were able to find not just, some antiquities that were in his compound awaiting sale further on. They were able to uncover this vast, complicated system that they had that was really industrial. They had this ministry of so-called extraction. They had a permitting system. They were wholesale plundering the sites within their control. Again, this was visible from space level of the operation. You could see it in satellite photos. And so we did have close to real-time information of this happening, which, we haven't had in previous conflicts. And while we'll probably never know the amount of money they made from it, we do know that they were very good businessmen.
And they were very good PR people.
Yes. And so, yes, they were investing these resources into looting and trafficking shows that it was financially successful for them. They even had letterhead for their looting operation.
Yeah, it's just amazing. And things, you alluded to this earlier, but the developments that have occurred since 1970 when the law came out have really enabled the trade and the growth in the trade. Now that we have secure means of payment, secure means of communication, you don't have to show up in a bricks and mortar dealer to select your antiquity. Everything can be done virtually or remotely. Can you talk a little bit about what the challenges are in now identifying this trade?
Art and antiquities crime is a hugely challenging crime to combat from a law enforcement perspective. Obviously, there's a lot of money in the art and antiquities market, and that in itself, even if you didn't have any of these other factors, money is attractive to criminals. But beyond the dollar value, there's so many other factors about the market that contribute to it being highly vulnerable. There is this longstanding culture of what I think the market would call discretion, what others may call secrecy. There is a frequent use of intermediaries, offshore accounts, shell companies, trust, and all of these things can conceal an object's real owner. It can also conceal a company's real owner. Latchford used these to great effect, but there's also the unique nature of cultural property itself. It's very portable. Its value is highly subjective. You can have two equally qualified experts be not just thousands, but millions of dollars off how they value a piece. And that can be millions of dollars off what someone's actually willing to pay for it. And the other big factor that puts it at risk is that despite all of these things, we don't have the legal protections in the market that we have for literally every industry of comparable risk and scale.
And we don't have really accurate numbers on the size of the trade.
Exactly. There's so little that we don't know. We see the tip of the iceberg. We see what goes up for public auction. We see what goes into museum collections, but that's it.
We see what's been seized by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office.
A growing list every year. So, we're seeing just what breaks the surface. And so there is this huge iceberg, I think, underneath, our line of sight of what the real problem is.
So we've talked about, some of the players in this market, and some definitely are unwitting players in this. They don't know. They're looking at the provenances that have been faked, and it's an art sometimes to do the research, although certainly a little more research could be done. In some of the cases, you might want to share the story of the golden mummy that we talked a little bit about earlier, as I think that's a fascinating case and a very good example of some of the challenges in combating this crime.
So the Golden Mummy is a story that writes itself. For one, it involves Kim Kardashian, who I don't think any of us were expecting to intersect with our world. And long story short, in recent years, there has been, this police probe that has spanned numerous different countries that has implicated the Metropolitan Museum, among others, in a transnational trafficking network out of Egypt in war zones across the Middle East and North Africa, including Libya, Syria, Yemen. I think it's important to stress that no charges have been brought against any official at a museum in the United States, including at the Met. But a related criminal case is moving forward for the same network against the former head of the Louvre in France. And U.S. law enforcement have seized millions of dollars worth of Egyptian treasures from the Met, alleging that these were, evidence of the criminal possession of stolen property. But these latest developments, the criminal case with the Louvre, the seizures, these are just the latest chapter in the scandal that goes back many years now. For in 2019, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office seized this, 2,000 plus year old golden Egyptian coffin from the Met Museum. We now know that this piece was looted during the chaos surrounding the revolution and then laundered onto the U.S. art market. And the museum paid $4 million for this, $4 million, bought on forged papers. And, again, as I mentioned, Kim Kardashian had a role in this piece's recovery. She was at the Met Gala in 2019 wearing this beautiful gold dress. So, of course, the photographers wanted her to stand next to this beautiful gold coffin. And that picture went viral around the world. And it actually eventually led to one of the criminals in the ring reaching out because he had never been paid, having seen Kim Kardashian's figure, on social media. And so they now know exactly how this piece was stolen. Again, it was just one of a number that went through this network, just one of a number that went to the Met.
Now, mistakes in the provenance papers that with perhaps a good Google search might have identified the inaccuracies.
Yes, exactly. And, it's a lot easier to forge a provenance than it is to forge an antiquity. And so what we see, whether it's Latchford or this network, they create these backstories. And unfortunately, the backstory for this Egyptian piece should not have passed muster. It actually had included a export permit from the Arab Republic of Egypt. Well, the Arab Republic of Egypt didn't exist at the date this paper was supposedly issued. Something that could be easily disproved, as you mentioned, with a quick Google search. You don't always need a PhD in Egyptology to figure out these things.
So let's talk then about what can be done. I mean, it's an overwhelming global problem. It's facilitated now by express mail and secure WhatsApp and Signal and these other items. What can law enforcement, what can individuals be doing to help?
Well, again, while this is a challenging problem, thankfully there is a lot that can be done. We have seen some major successes, especially in recent years from U.S. law enforcement. They're really doing a fantastic job in investigating and prosecuting these cases, although it's important to stress there is so much that needs to be done. But one issue is that, as we've discussed a lot today, if it's treated as a crime, it's treated as a victimless crime. And that is not true whatsoever. There are many victims of, cultural racketeering. We all lose out when this history about the past is lost. But again, this, it's funding very, very bad actors around the world. It's funding crime. It's funding conflict. It's funding terrorism. And so I think the first thing needs to be an appreciation of that there are reasons to care about this from the perspective of national security, for fighting transnational crime, for promoting economic integrity. And so that realization has led to a slow and growing change. As you mentioned earlier, we're not seeing criminal penalties match the impact of this crime. People often get off with a slap on the wrist. Think of it this way. In what other world, if you have millions of dollars worth of stolen property and you give it back and you're not penalized, you're congratulated? That's what we see quite frequently. This is stolen property, but it's still an uphill battle to get it treated as other stolen property.
We've seen a big change in the political will and the attitudes towards this. And Irina Bokova was talking about this in another episode about the differing attitudes in the United Nations, the development of political will. But we've started to see other major international institutions take this up as well. Tess, can you talk a little about that?
Yes, this has especially grown since, I would say, the 2003 looting of the Baghdad Museum in Iraq. I think with that, the world's government started to wake up at just how harmful this issue could be, what a negative impact. And today, we're not just seeing this discussed at archaeology conferences or, amongst museums. This is a topic of discussion in the world's leading intergovernmental institutions, whether we're talking about the G20 or NATO or even the UN Security Council. And just the fact that the UN Security Council has, issued a number of binding and unanimous resolutions, that's hugely important, not just because of what those resolutions say, but the fact that they're discussing this at all shows that the international community recognizes that this is a threat to peace and security. That's the UN Security Council's mandate. And so that recognition has a trickle-down effect in a very positive way across government. So one thing that the Antiquities Coalition is actively doing is working to get this discussion. We don't feel that this should be the burden of the cultural sector alone, that it is critical to have law enforcement at the table, to have ministries of foreign affairs at the table, to have militaries at the table, because this is an issue that impacts all of them, and there are things that all of these groups can do.
Well said. It really is. And that's why I think there's focus on this coalition building because it's such a large scale issue. There's so many different parts to it that it requires a real coordinated effort. So we've talked a lot about the big challenges and the threats to heritage. What's positive in this? Where do you feel that you're making a difference?
On the one hand, every time I feel that we get our heads around a crisis, there's a new one erupting, a new conflict. And it's heartbreaking to see whether you're talking about Sudan or Ukraine or Yemen, dealing with the same problem that Cambodia dealt with half a century ago, that Western Europe dealt with in World War II. But on the other hand, we're also seeing unprecedented action, which is very encouraging. Look at what happened in Cambodia in the 1970s. There was actually an effort there to close U.S. borders in the 1970s to blood antiquities coming out of Cambodia. It was unsuccessful. There was no policy change at the time. Again, this material flooded the U.S. market. Compare that to what happened with Daesh or with ISIS 10 years ago. And there was a charge led by, in many ways, the museum community, including, to its credit, the Met, to make sure that that same mistake didn't happen again. We didn't have governments denying that it was a problem. They were out there releasing the satellite imagery, showing the looting, taking action. And that's a very short time period in between the two to see such a different reaction. That said, criminals are constantly evolving. They evolve much faster than our laws do, than our law enforcement does. And so, as the saying goes, we're frequently fighting the last battle. So it still very much is an uphill struggle, but it is encouraging to see this issue break into the consciousness of, our leading policymakers, the UN Security Council among them. But it's also becoming an issue now for public discussion. John Oliver devoted an entire 30-minute episode to this issue recently. That raises awareness amongst everyone, amongst those in government, amongst the people who may be unknowingly interested in buying this material. So there is reason to hope.
Well, thanks, Tess. I think we could continue on. We've really just scratched the surface, but we appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us today and the good work that you're doing in combating this illicit trade. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, and I look forward to hearing the future episodes.
Thank you for listening to Tholos Talks, a series by the Basilinna Institute. Available on Spotify, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Make sure to follow and subscribe to our channels to stay up to date on upcoming episodes. To learn more about these topics or the work we're doing, visit the Basilinna website.